Hey there, you are listening to Incorruptible Massachusetts. Our mission is to help you understand state politics. So we discuss why it is so broken, what we can have in our lives if we fixed it, and then how you can get involved. So got my great co-host here, Jordan Berg Powers and Jonathan Cohn. Jordan Berg Powers, you want to introduce yourself?
My name is Jordan Berg Powers. I work in electoral politics in Massachusetts, or at least I work in progressive politics in Massachusetts, and I use he, him.
Jonathan Cohn.
Jonathan Cohn, he, him, and I've been an active volunteer in progressive issue advocacy and electoral campaigns here in Massachusetts, based in Boston.
Anna Callahan, she, her, living in Medford. Also love working on state politics, super excited about what we could do if we fixed our state house. So today we are going to talk about something that may seem a little bit wonky. We know some of our listeners are a little wonky. We love the wonky listeners. We love the less wonky listeners. I tend to be a less wonky person. So I am excited today, though, to talk about a topic that is going to be pretty detailed. We are going to talk about redistricting. So every 10 years, there is a census. And that is the federal government, does their absolute best to figure out who lives in the country and, all sorts of details about those people. And that census happened last year. And then after the census happens, there is redistricting, and that happens at the local level, it happens at the state level, and it happens at the national level. That's what we're talking about today, because we're currently in the process of redistricting and re-precincting. We'll talk about both of those. So we'll also discuss how it affects our state legislature and the state elections coming up in 2022. So I would love to just have, Jonathan, do you want to jump in and talk a little bit about redistricting and kind of what it is, what process we're in right now?
Awesome. So yeah, Anna, as you noted, every 10 years, we have that decennial US Census to count to the best possible who all lives where in the US, right? And people probably remember that. Hopefully everybody listening had filled out the census form online or in paper or last year. And the census provides vital data for redistricting, as we'll talk about soon, as well as kind of for public health purposes, for school purposes, for federal funding and state funding purposes, because anything that relies on knowing who lives where, what the demographics of a population are, it's going to be important. And then after we get that new census data every 10 years, what happens is that states redraw the lines for their congressional districts and their state legislative districts. And then cities redraw council districts at least here in Massachusetts, or at least in Boston where we have council districts, some rely on wards, some municipalities just rely on wards. Boston, that'll be next year. Because if you think about it, if all of our lines currently are based on the data that we had from a decade ago. People move, new people are born, people die. Many different things can happen in any of all of those places in the state over 10 years. And we still have the goal of our 9 congressional districts should all have roughly the same amount of people, or same number of people. All 160 state rep districts should have the same number of people within reason, and all 40 Senate districts. Those numbers are fixed, right? We could argue whether the U.S. House of Representatives should have a floating number of members of Congress. They should, in my opinion. But right now, they're fixed. We have our 9 apportioned this year, and we have to adjust all of the lines accordingly so that they reflect the population with an idea of one person, one vote, so that you don't have some areas where you have voting power is diluted by a number of people packed into one district and a heavily depopulated district elsewhere. And kind of redistricting is something that can be often overlooked, but it's key for determining who not only the census is who lives where, redistricting is who represents you. Because that can determine who represents you, whether communities are able to elect the people that they think can best represent them depends on that. That's why we've seen in a number of states around the country, Republicans often doing shady things around redistricting, because it determines who controls power. It does that no matter where, like in a partisan segment of who controls power, but who draws the lines and how they draw lines, all of that ultimately intersects with questions of power.
And I'm going to jump in for 1 second and just say, this is one of the reasons why state politics really matters, because it is the states, it is the state governments that do this redistricting. And that's part of the sort of Republican plan, is to take over states, redistrict in a way that reduces the power of people of color, of Democrats, of progressives, and they succeed in doing that. So it's important that we pay attention to these things, wonky as they are.
Yeah, and that's because you can draw maps that empower communities of color, that empower young people, that empower and have low-income communities, or you can draw maps that do the opposite. And so that's why that there are a lot of questions at stake around issues of power and representation in state government. But I will pass it on to Jordan to talk a little bit about like why this year's timeline was kind of messed up by typical standards.
Yeah, so as many things, anything that Trump touches, that he really screwed it up. I was about to curse and I was just trying to stop myself right away.
I was like laughing because I was like, this is, I hope, the first time that we've ever talked about him on this podcast.
It is the first time.
Just didn't,
yeah,
I
which is good because we have obsessed about it. But in this case, this is directly
we don't allow curse words like.
Yeah, we can't say the T word. Okay, so the Commerce Department underneath the last president, who is responsible for the census. So what is weird about the census, and this, I think it's hard for people to understand this, but we know how many Americans there are and we know where they live. Generally speaking, they have addresses, they interact with the state. There's a lot of ways that we could count people. And the Supreme Court said, nah, you can't do that. The Constitution is clear. You have to go through a process of physically counting people every 10 years. So yeah, so we can't so that we have this weird thing where we know, for example, that the number of people that the census says lives in Worcester or lives in Chelsea are not actually the number of people who live there. Right? We know this for a fact, but we can't do anything. So redistricting cannot say this is the number of people we know live here and we can redistrict around it. Redistricting can only count the people who are counted in the census as a part of the redistricting process. So even though we know that something like 60 to 80,000 people, I don't remember off the top of my head, in Chelsea live there, only something like 40,000 people were actually counted. That means 40,000 people filled out the census in Chelsea, and that's all that gets to count towards your state rep, your state senate, your Congress. So I think it's important to know that, because the census is not how many people live in a place. I love these, the media is, again, terrible in a lot of things, and they just say like, oh, this is America. And I was like, but it's not. We know what America looks like. There are much better ways to find out where America is than to go through a process of filling it out online. So the last president's Commerce Department, he made a decision to both not physically count people, so not go door by door, not call people, not try to make sure the count is correct. He also chose to not have much paper, but to do almost all of it online. So you went online and you filled it out. And all of those things meant that we had one of the worst counts we've had in years. And it meant two ways it really went over. First, we definitely undercounted a bunch of people of color across the country, and certainly in Massachusetts. I don't know to the extent of other states because I haven't studied it, but I know in Massachusetts we have undercounted the people of color. So that means that people of color won't get their full representation in our elected bodies because we can't legally count them. The other thing that happened is that because of how they went about it, they so screwed up the data that the data normally comes out February, March. You get some early data. April, it's usually finalized. And we have a law on our books in Massachusetts that that the cities have to finish their re-precincting, their drawing of the lines by June 15th. That is still the law. No one has changed to that law. It is not June 15th. We're not done. I have yet to see the police start arresting city clerks. I am waiting for it to happen. I hear that the police enforce the law. There is a law in the books, and no legislator and no city clerk has been arrested for violating this clear violation of the law. So anyway, this is my pet peeve
But the
about the way
census
we
was
talk
delayed,
about it.
right? So it's not
It's
just
not their
like they're
fault.
not sitting on their butts.
But the
yeah.
legislature could have gotten rid of this law. It could have said, you know what it isn't anymore? June 15th. Maybe we should get rid of the law that says that it should have been finished by then. And in fairness, the House actually passed a law, I think June 14th. Like, it really waited to the last second, which it did not need to do. We knew this was going to be a problem all year, and they could at any point simply fixed it. But of course, our legislature is incompetent to its core, cannot meet a deadline that is by law, right? By law, it's in the law. So they passed it.
What if they just like were never adjourned on June 15th, but they just keep saying it's still June 15th?
Because it doesn't matter, because there's still the law that's at the cities. It's not even them, it's the cities that have to do it. And then the state Senate was like, we don't want to do this, because Bill Galvin threw a hissy fit about changing the re-precincting law. But again, it's past June 15th, so it doesn't make any sense. So this is where we are right now. The census was delayed. We just got some legacy data, which, to be clear, again, is actually not the final census data. The final census data will come out in mid-September, but we have enough data that we can start redrawing lines. So it normally comes out April. It's gonna be September. That difference in time is a huge problem for our process, and it has real problems that even with our legislature's total incompetence is still not their fault, right? Like, this isn't their fault that the delay has happened, to Jonathan's point, right? Like, it's not their fault that the data came out late and we're trying to figure this out. Like, none of us, as far as I can tell, and now this is my second redrawing of the lines, and I've asked around, no one has ever seen this, right? Like, we are flying blind in terms of how to do this, because it's never been that the data got so screwed up. If only we didn't have such an incompetent president.
Yeah, and super quick, just why the date that it comes out is important, and why the date of the redistricting is important, is when you draw those lines. So, for example, to run for a state rep seat or a state senate seat, you have to have lived in that district for a year before the election, November elections.
Just the state rep district. The state senate, in the Constitution of Massachusetts, you have to live in a state rep district a year before election day. You do not if you're running for state senate, because John Quincy Adams was in France and they did not want to, this is true, and we did not want to have that as a recommendation, because he didn't come back in time. His boat didn't get here in time. So when they wrote the Constitution of Massachusetts, they had a John Quincy Adams exemption for the Senate. So you only have to be a day before for the Senate and a year before for the House.
A day before?
Yeah, it's also a year for all the other constitutional offices. So your governor, your lieutenant governor, your secretary of states, they'll all also have to live in Massachusetts before. Interestingly, for Congress, you don't have to live in the district to serve in Congress, which is just a weird, because Congress sets the limitations, and there are Congress people currently in Congress who represent districts they don't live in.
Wow.
But yeah, so anyway, so just to clarify, weirdly, so that means, to Anna's point, that they would have to, that reps have to live in their districts at least by November 3rd, right? So in theory, so that means that they don't move, right? So they don't, if you give them no time to move, you would have to finish the district by November 3rd of this year.
That's why the timing of this matters. And I'm going to ask the redistricting, re-precincting question now, because city council and mayor elections, like municipal elections in Massachusetts, are on odd years, right? And the state elections are on even years, state and federal are on even. So what this means is that Re-precincting, doing this work around the precincts, it really doesn't affect the elections. But talk a little bit about which of those is supposed to happen first, which of those is going to happen first, like what the votes have been in the House and the Senate in terms of which one happens first. Jordan, do you want to jump in on this one?
Yes. So, historically, re-precincting happens first, and this is I will tell you that I get lost in this terminology. So let's just like break it down really easy for people. Your city clerk, your city elections office, your city, the town or city you live in, they draw lines. They say, you live in this part of the city, that is Ward 2 or Precinct 2 or whatever, however they draw it. Some towns, because they're so small, they're all the same. They're all one precinct. Some have 4, some have 8. It's all supposed to be, but the only regulations are that they have to be equal size. So if you say you split this town in half, they have to be equally half size within some, like there is some wiggle room. It doesn't have to be the exact number, but it has to be roughly the same within some wiggle room. And so, you divide the city so it's easier for people to go vote. So you're not going to the polls and waiting 3 hours, right? You want to draw a line so that people know roughly who they're voting for. So it's easy to figure out who you're voting for roughly. And so it's easy to go vote. And so normally what happens is after the census data comes out, your city clerk goes through the process of setting new lines based on roughly the same population to make it easy for people to figure out where they vote, to figure out who their city councilor is. Those lines then become the definitions of city council districts, and those lines are then used as the basis for state rep and state senate districts. The problem with that process, and that is re-precinct. So that's a precinct, that is a re-precinct. That means you're changing the lines of the precincts. Every city by law is supposed to change it. Only Boston hasn't and does it. I'm sure Jonathan has some thoughts about that. But just really quickly, the next thing that you then do is redistrict. So after you have some precincts together, so I live in Worcester, Ward 10. So after you have Ward 10, then you would draw state rep and state senates around that precinct. The problem with that process is that it's not the data that we get from the census is not by precinct because they don't have our precincts, right? It's national. It's by blocks, and blocks are literal city blocks. Sometimes it's a few blocks together, depending on how dense it is. Sometimes it's a literal block, right? The data is small in geography, and it allows for the census to give us information about where people live based on the things that we can redistrict around. And the thing that we care about as progressives and people who care about small d democracy is ensuring that people of color have an equal opportunity to have a say in their district. And the blocks allow us to do that at a granular level. So when you have re-precincting if you have redistricting coming after re-precincting, and we're one of the only states that does that. Almost no other state does this process. Most states, they redistrict and then draw some re-precinct lines in to make it work. Because you want to have your state rep, your state senate, your congressional data, you want to have as much opportunity to increase the opportunities for people of color to have a say as possible. And so redrawing your lines for your elected officials based on that smallest census data allows you to ensure that people of color are having their fair share based on the census. Doing it the opposite way is a way to dilute the power of people of color.
And you were talking a little bit before we started recording about how if the lines are drawn in a way that reduces the power of communities of color, then you can sue the state legislature. But if re-precincting is done first by the city clerks often, then it's not the fault of the state legislature. And so you would have to sue like dozens or hundreds of different city clerks, and it would be like incredibly difficult.
And city clerks are I'm a big believer in democracy in this process, I will say. I mean, it's not perfect. We certainly have lots of problems with redistricting. I don't want to sugarcoat that there needs to be oversight, but it's hard to have democratic processes for 351 towns and city clerks. Many of them are unelected, many of them are appointed. They're usually older, they're usually whiter, not all, but in some cases. And so, they're not accountable in the same ways that a state legislature is. And the courts have a harder time, right? How are you going to prove? It's harder to sue, right? 100 city clerks who have re-precincted in a way that's racist. But I can sue the legislature. That's one entity that if they do a problem, right, I can easily hold them accountable. So it's also just in terms of oversight, the courts are our only real oversight in this process in Massachusetts. And if we do it the other way, as you said, it makes it hard to hold them accountable. Whereas if we use the census blocks, draw districts, and they draw those districts in a way that are discriminatory, I know who to sue. It's one group to sue. There's one person, right?
So
it just makes
I'm
it
going
much
to jump in. So I'm just looking at time. We don't have a lot of time left, and there's so many things I want to cover. I would love to, Jordan, if we can stick with you and just have you talk a little bit about the Drawing Democracy Coalition, and
before
then,
we do, let's have Jonathan talk about Boston and why this process. This is really important.
Yeah. So one issue. Before we were talking about. And I was thinking of Boston immediately when you talked about drawing precincts of equal size, which is something that doesn't exist and never happens in Boston, because Boston is exempt from that process of redrawing wards and precincts. And I was just looking up, shout out to the folks at, I live at Spark Boston. I got it from Zeba Cranmer, shout out Zeba, but I live with our colleague Max, who did the analysis of the variation in the number of active voters by precincts in Boston. So there are a few that are like 6,000 or more people per precinct, even though the average size is less than half of that for a precinct. So you have some like the Seaport, which has grown massively over the past decade, is a massive precinct. You have a place like Ward 5 Precinct 1, which is a combination of Chinatown, parts of Chinatown, parts of the South End, the entirety of Bay Village, and downtown by Emerson College, all put together in one massive precinct. And when you have situations like, and then you also have one precinct on the Harbor Islands that has anywhere from 0 to 3 voters, depending on the year. 0 this year, had 1 last year.
What?
And it's still its own precinct. And kind of like and so that creates like a fundamental inequity when it comes to like how many people per precinct, which determines the lines you experience at the polls and all of that. And so Boston hasn't actually changed these lines in 100 years. And one of the things that advocates see as a great potential of kind of allowing kind of redistricting to happen before re-precincting is it helps give an extra push to actually redrawing the precincts in Boston. Kind of, for example, that you have like the census block that I live in is actually takes parts of 3 different precincts in it. And so you have a situation like that, and especially it's all of like the college heavy areas around here. It's also useful because if the census block has all of the college heavy areas, it helps you understand where the college students live, as opposed to my precinct, which is a mix of college student heavy areas and heavily Russian and Chinese senior housing, which are very different constituencies. And then to be able to disaggregate that, which you can much do better with census data, helps you see what exactly you're doing when building up the districts.
And so the process so what we would like is for the Drawing Democracy Coalition, which we could talk about a little bit, is to have the re-precincting happen after redistricting. So first, you set up the new districts for Congress, for state reps, state senate, all the districts, and then you draw the lines that make sense to fit into those. It's what most states do. It is not radical. It's not some nefarious thing, despite the efforts. But what it does do is it takes away power from unelected people. So of course, our Secretary of State, Bill Galvin, is against it because it's more democratic. And so it takes away power from the people he oversees who are relatively untouched by democracy. So of course he's against it. And the House did the right thing and it passed it to try to fix this process and to put us in line with most other states. And the Senate just did nothing. It didn't say no, it didn't say anything, it just did nothing for months. June passes, July passes, we go into August, and finally they said, we want to do it differently. How will they do it differently? What will that process look like? We don't have time for them to go through this thing. And so this is, again, where it overlaps with this podcast, which is that our system is broken because you wouldn't, in any sort of logical way, wait till now to declare that you don't want to do it the way that everybody's asking you to do it, the way people of color are asking you to do it, the way groups who are experts are asking you to do it, the way other states do it, the way the House got it together to fix. You're just like, we're going to do something else, right? And so Anna, when we started this podcast, asked, well, like, what's the next process? And the answer is, we don't know, because the Senate is at a logjam with the House. So if you can't you can't do half in, half out, right? Otherwise, you get into something which may break the law, which is you have a district, right? You're running for state rep, and you have a precinct that's half you, half another person. How will I know who I'm voting for, right? Based on my street? Like, that's a direct recipe for disaster. So we don't want to have that happen. The Senate has put us in a situation where that might happen unless it acts for some common sense. And so, but we don't know what will happen. Or we re-precinct, and then that takes 4 months. Like, there's not a realistic end goal. And so, just to put some timeframes for people, because some people ask them, well, why don't we just push it off to, Trump messed it up, let's just put it off to 2024. But it's in our Constitution. So there are states, if you've seen in the news where, like, Texas redistricted in the middle of a session, or North Carolina, they don't have restrictions. Massachusetts does. We, in our Constitution, which means we would have to change our Constitution, which we can't do in time, we have to redistrict by 2022. The new districts have to be in place by 2022. And so we don't have time. There's no other alternative. Like, you can't fix the timeline. It is what it is. We need to work around what we have, and we have 2 months. So more than ever, we need to redistrict first, get that done, and then re-precinct, because there's no time.
And can you just briefly talk about the Drawing Democracy Coalition?
Yeah, so the Drawing Democracy Coalition is a coalition of a bunch of anchored by our C3 table, which is anchored by communities of color and groups of color and groups that represent them. The Massachusetts voter table is our anchor partner for the Drawing Democracy Coalition. Mass Alliance, which is also a part of it, is also an anchor part of it for the C4 side, and it's all the groups coming together to ensure that in this process we do the best we can to maximize opportunities for people of color to have a say in their democracy. It is guided around the Voting Rights Act. So for those of you who care about the Voting Rights Act, again, this is another important place. A lot of the ways we talk about these issues, the guidance for these issues across the country that have been adopted by our state and other places are guidelines set by the Voting Rights Act, and it's ways to ensure that people of color have a say. Our legislature is relatively responsive, surprisingly. I think because some of them went to jail. For those of you who don't know, we had a speaker go to jail over the redistricting process, and their maps got thrown out by a judge, and they had to redo it. So they do not want to go through that process. They do not want to go to jail, and they do not want to go to court. So they are willing to work with us in a way that is actually surprising and really a credit to the staff of and the people in the redistricting parts of the state house. So they want to work with us. So what the Drawing Democracy Coalition is going to do is it's going to create its own maps, what Congress should look like, what state rep and state senate should look like, and we're going to submit it to the state to the state house. The state house will then take that into consideration, draw maps. They'll then, hopefully, we don't know for sure, hold some hearings to say, here's our message. We then can react to them, say, we like this, we don't like that, and then they vote to finalize it. And then if it breaks any laws, we go to court. If it doesn't, then those are the maps.
Amazing. Last topic, Jonathan, can you talk to us a little bit about historically whether the process of redistricting causes there to be more open seats?
Yeah, so one thing, and like Jordan, you might know specifically from the last go around with this, but one thing that you end up typically seeing a wave of retirements around redistricting, because if you think about it, if suddenly your district changes in a way that's unfavorable to you, or if you suspect that's going to happen, you might see if there's an opportunity to move up, you might go. You
mean if you're a state rep? If
you're a state rep, yeah, if you're a state rep or a state senator moving up for something, right? And anything that's above you, if you see an opportunity, or if it's even like a job opportunity elsewhere that you're toying with, something might seem more attractive if you realize maybe it's your district grows larger than you feel like it. And there are some massive ones in the state. Or if you're let's say, if a more conservative rep in an area that's rapidly diversifying, you might think, I'm out. Or if the partisan composition of your district changes, so that you used to be a reliably Democratic district that's gotten more conservative, or a reliably conservative district that's gotten more Democratic. based on the drawing, since people like incumbents don't like running in unknown or unfriendly territory. So if when things change, it kind of creates that, or even the prospect of change can lead to that. In a way, if they decide in advance of drawing the lines, it makes the life of the line drawers easier. Since even though they shouldn't be drawing the districts with the incumbents in mind, they do. Like that's unless
No,
they
they actually have to.
oh, they have
can't,
to?
Yeah, they can't, there are some restrictions on purposefully hurting people.
Yeah.
So like if
Yeah.
you redistrict somebody out of their district, you have to have a reason that you can defend in court.
Yeah.
Otherwise you could be open to a lawsuit. So there is some consideration for that, in fairness.
Yeah, so it's not like, it's not as though some people might have incumbent protection for like shoring them up. Some might use that, some might not, but not willfully and illegally drawing people out of their districts is like, you have to pay attention to that. And so if people just leave, suddenly you have a lot of free territory to play around with when you're drawing the maps. So it'll be interesting to see as like especially as legislators are eyeing these maps, do people take an opportunity to do something different or to retire if they're like bordering retirement age anyway, or past it anyway?
Which means a nice opportunity to elect some great people in 22.
Yep. For people just really quickly, easy to understand, Acton is split up between 2 reps right now. There are 2 reps there. 1 rep is leaving. It doesn't make a lot of sense for Acton to be brought up. Maybe it gets put together. But you can't put it together. It's harder to put it together if there are 2 reps living there. Because then you have to prove by court, like, why did you do this? So 10 years ago, they got rid of 2 districts where reps lived in them. And then one of them was Democrat and one of them was a Republican, literally so that they would like say like, look, it's not we're not doing it for partisan reasons. It just made sense for the like how to make the numbers work. So that was like a way that they avoided. But so I just want to say really quickly, that this is really complicated stuff. And a lot of the way the media covers it is an oversimplification. I hate the way we talk about gerrymandering. I want to encourage you to look at John Oliver's report about this. It's actually really difficult. And we struggle with some things. You're often holding up 2 competing equally important things, like keeping districts together. But what if there are people of color? Like, there's a part of Haverhill which has a lot of Latinos who actually probably live closer to Lawrence or close. Do you put them in a district with Lawrence and break up, or Methuen into Lawrence, right? Do you break up Methuen? And that's a problem, right? People who live in a city should get to vote together. But there's these people that might feel closer to Lawrence, right? That's a complicated question. And the truth is that like it might be, and there's no right answer, but what does need to happen is the only way that legislators can wade through this is if you plug in. If you tell them, this is what I want to happen. They do take that into account because they're not experts in every little place, in every little nook and cranny. So the Drawing Democracy is a great coalition to have that. And I want to encourage you to join it.
Fantastic. Jordan, you wanted to mention one other call to action about
members
of Congress.
Call your members of Congress. This is happening right as a human tragedy around Afghanistan that the US has created. I want to encourage you to call your member of Congress. No matter how progressive they are not doing enough. They are not progressive enough on this issue. We need to let in refugees. My preference is to let in every refugee who wants to come to America from Afghanistan. We have destroyed that country. I think it's the least we could do. We certainly should let in anybody from a marginalized community of any sort come in to America who's a refugee from Afghanistan. Worcester is a refugee resettlement. We're one of the largest resettlement cities in the country. We have the means to do it. So encourage them to lift all bans, or at least one that you're comfortable with, to a level. We let in over 100,000 Vietnamese following Vietnam. We have let in less than 2,000 Afghanis. And it's just a human tragedy that we have created. So please call your member of Congress and let them know.
Amazing. Great. Well, thank you both so much. And thanks everybody for sticking around for this whole talk. We will see you all next week. Bye-bye.